The forest was never silent in the Middle Ages. Beneath its endless canopy, where the light of dawn struggled through the web of branches, the world was alive, whispering, breathing, watching. In those forgotten centuries, the forest was not just a place of mystery. It was a home, a fortress, a test of will. For the peasants, the travelers, the monks, and the outlaws of the medieval world, survival here meant understanding nature in ways we can hardly imagine today. The early morning mist drifted low across the moss-covered roots, curling around the legs of men who walked silently through the undergrowth. Their cloaks were damp with dew, and their boots sank softly into the wet earth. No one spoke. In the medieval forest, speech was a luxury. Sound could carry far, and predators, both animal and human, listened for it. The silence of the forest was a form of respect and a form of defense. Long before the age of cities, electricity, or even reliable maps, people of Europe depended on the vast woods that blanketed the land. Oak, ash, and birch were more than trees. They were tools, medicine, and sometimes even allies. Men and women who lived close to nature developed instincts that would seem supernatural today. They could tell direction not from a compass, but from the way moss grew thicker on one side of the trunk. They could sense approaching rain by the smell of the soil, or by the rhythm of bird calls fading into quiet. Every traveler entering a forest in the 12th century carried an unspoken fear: getting lost. The medieval woods could stretch for days, unbroken by any path. To move safely, one had to read the forest the way we read books. Fallen branches pointed to the direction of the wind. Animal trails revealed where water lay, and even the shape of anthills hinted at the nearest clearing. The forest, to those who listened, was always speaking. Survival began with fire, not just for warmth, but for protection and signaling. Yet lighting a fire was no easy feat. The tinder of the medieval traveler came from the inner bark of birch trees, scraped thin like paper. Flint and steel sparked against it, sending faint orange embers that had to be nursed carefully with breath, coaxed into flame. A single fire could mean the difference between life and death on a cold night, but it had to be hidden. Smoke in the wrong place could draw attention, from wolves, from bandits, or from watchmen enforcing the king's law against poaching. Food came from the forest too, but not without skill. Wild garlic, nettles, and sorrel made stews that kept hunger away when game was scarce. Mushrooms, carefully chosen, offered protein and flavor, but a single mistake could be deadly. Medieval foragers learned to test fungus with silver pins or by observing animal behavior. If birds pecked and survived, the mushroom was safe. If they died, the forest gave a warning that few ignored twice. Water, clear and cold, was found in trickling brooks and hidden springs. Travelers learned to follow the flight of insects. Bees and dragonflies often marked the path to fresh water. Before drinking, they would strain it through cloth or layers of moss, using nature's own filter. The knowledge wasn't written in books. It was passed by word of mouth, from one wanderer to another, whispered like prayer in the hush of the woods. Shelter was an art of patience. Branches interlocked to form crude lean-tos, sealed with leaves and mud. A bed of pine needles offered insulation from the damp ground. In harsher climates, hollow trees became sanctuaries, warm, windproof, and surprisingly safe. In the great forests of medieval England and France, some hermits built entire lives inside these hollow trunks, lighting small fires that smoked upward through cracks like breath from the lungs of the tree itself. The forest provided medicine too. Willow bark for pain, yarrow for bleeding, and plantain for wounds. These remedies, rediscovered centuries later, were part of the daily survival kit of medieval foresters. They learned to listen to the forest's healing rhythm, to watch which plants animals sought when injured, and mimic their instincts. Nature was their teacher, and observation their scripture. But survival wasn't only about nature, it was also about people. The medieval forest was filled with danger from men as much as from beasts. Outlaws, deserters, and starving peasants often hid in the woods. Travelers learned to spot signs of human presence: a broken branch, a footprint in soft mud, a strand of wool caught on bark. They moved quietly, avoiding trails where men might ambush them. A fire, even a faint glow, could betray one's location to unfriendly eyes. So many travelers learned to cook with stones, heating them in one fire, then burying them under a second layer of earth to cook food invisibly, without smoke or light. Nightfall was a different world entirely. When the last light died and the forest dissolved into darkness, sight was useless. Ears became the only sense that mattered. The cry of an owl meant safety. It frightened smaller predators. The silence of birds meant danger. Travelers would listen for the distant snap of twigs or the sound of breath carried by wind. They would sleep lightly, wrapped in cloaks, with knives within reach. In the medieval forest, no one truly slept. They drifted between vigilance and exhaustion, waiting for dawn. To survive was to adapt, to become a creature of the forest. Some learned to walk barefoot, feeling vibrations through the soil that warned of movement nearby. Others smeared themselves with mud or crushed herbs to hide their scent from wolves. Hunters, poachers, and wanderers developed their own codes, carved symbols on trees marking safe campsites or nearby water. These were the unspoken maps of the medieval woods, known only to those who lived and died among them. Over generations, these forest people, woodcutters, monks, hermits, and travelers, built a quiet science of survival. They studied the patterns of animal migration, the seasons of fruiting trees, the nesting habits of birds. Their knowledge was deep, empirical, and spiritual all at once. They believed that every tree had a guardian spirit, and to harm one without prayer would bring misfortune. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. Belief itself kept balance between man and nature. When famine struck or war burned the countryside, it was this forest wisdom that kept people alive. Refugees would vanish into the green shadows, building hidden settlements among the ferns. They used bark to weave baskets, sap to seal wounds, and charcoal to preserve meat. Some even claimed to read the smoke of campfires. Thin smoke meant wet wood, thick meant dry. Its color could tell whether resin or fungus burned within. Such details might seem trivial, but in a world where one mistake could mean starvation, every observation mattered. Modern preppers speak of bug-out bags and solar kits, but their medieval counterparts carried little more than a knife, a flint, and an unshakable familiarity with the living world. They knew that nature rewarded patience and punished arrogance. A man who rushed through the woods without awareness might step into a hidden pit or anger a wild boar. A man who listened, who waited, who blended with the rhythm of trees, could travel for days unseen. Centuries later, most of that knowledge is gone. The maps of the forest have faded, and the language of survival, once spoken in gestures, scents, and sounds, has been forgotten. But if you walk alone in an ancient wood today, and the wind sighs through the leaves, listen carefully. Beneath the noise of modern life, the forest still remembers. Its secrets lie buried in roots and soil, waiting for anyone patient enough to learn the way their ancestors once did. Quietly, respectfully, and with the understanding that to survive the forest, you must first become part of it. The forest had grown darker now, not from the setting sun, but from the density of the trees themselves. The medieval woods were vast beyond comprehension, a labyrinth where sunlight pierced only in narrow beams, illuminating patches of moss and ferns like fragments of a hidden world. Every sound was amplified: the snap of a twig beneath a boot, the distant call of a raven, the rustle of leaves as some unseen creature passed through the underbrush. Those who entered this world without knowledge were at the mercy of its silent rules, a fact understood by only the most seasoned travelers, hunters, and hermits who had spent years learning to move unseen and unheard. The first lesson of the medieval forest was patience. Unlike the open fields where one could see an enemy or a deer approaching from afar, the forest demanded careful observation and deliberate action. Travelers learned to pause frequently, listening not just with their ears, but with every sense. The subtle vibrations of the earth beneath their feet, the faint metallic tang of blood carried on the wind, the almost imperceptible shift in shadows, all conveyed information. In the Middle Ages, there was no GPS, no compass capable of replacing the intimate knowledge of one's surroundings. those who ignored these subtleties did so at their peril. Water remained a lifeline, yet finding it was rarely straightforward. Streams often twisted unpredictably beneath canopies of oak and beech. One false step could lead to a hidden bog, quicksand-like in its grip, capable of swallowing a man up to his knees or more. Medieval travelers understood these dangers instinctively, having studied the flora and fauna surrounding these waters. The presence of certain grasses, the burrow patterns of small mammals, and even the flight of birds provided subtle hints. Dragonflies and other insects frequently hovered near clean water, a clue that survival might be found nearby. Collecting water demanded both speed and discretion. A visible splash or glint could alert predators, human or animal, and so, water was often drawn with a piece of hollowed wood or a carefully layered leaf. Food was no less demanding. Foraging required not only knowledge of edible plants, but also the rhythm of their growth. Wild garlic sprouted in clusters near streams, nettles could provide sustenance when cooked correctly, and certain berries were safe only in specific seasons. Mushrooms were a domain of danger. The difference between nourishment and poison could be a single subtle variation in color, cap shape, or smell. Medieval survival manuals, though scarce, were less relied upon than oral traditions, seasoned. Hunters would pass on knowledge with gestures, hand signs, and demonstrations. Every mistake could be fatal, making every successful meal a victory of both skill and intuition. Hunting, when practiced, demanded an understanding of more than the prey itself. Medieval hunters and poachers read the forest as an extension of the prey's mind. Deer, wild boar, and rabbits all had habits, paths, and territories that could be studied and anticipated. Hunters learned to move with the wind, ensuring their scent did not carry toward the animals they stalked. The crunch of leaves beneath, boots had to be timed carefully. In some cases, a hunter would use soft moss or fallen pine needles to muffle each step. Traps were set using materials from the forest itself, a springing branch, a carefully tied vine, or a hollow log positioned over a path. But beyond the mechanics, the hunter needed patience, for the forest often tested endurance more than skill. Waiting hours or days for the correct moment was not unusual. Shelter took on a new meaning in the medieval forest. Unlike the open plains, where a tent or small hut might suffice, the forest required ingenuity and subtlety. Branches could be interwoven to create a lean-to, with leaves and moss providing insulation. For long-term survival, hollowed-out trees offered concealment and warmth. In particularly cold or wet climates, the art of bedding, layering leaves, pine needles, or reeds, could mean the difference between life and death. Hermits, monks, or outlaws often used the forest not only as refuge, but also as a living classroom, observing and interacting with the environment in ways that would be unthinkable to the casual traveler. They learned to build, cook, and heal using only the materials the forest offered. Fire was both a gift and a danger. It provided warmth, light, and the means to cook, but also drew attention. Medieval travelers learned to manage smoke carefully, using it to signal allies or deter animals without exposing themselves to enemies. They sometimes constructed hidden hearths, heating stones to cook food without producing visible flames. Flint and steel were precious commodities, as a fire could not be started easily in wet conditions. Even the choice of wood mattered. Some woods burned long and hot, while others smoked excessively or produced sparks that could betray one's location. Herbal knowledge was vital. Willow bark for pain, yarrow for stopping bleeding, and sage or mint for digestive aid, all were gathered with care. But these remedies required timing, preparation, and sometimes secrecy. Knowledge of herbs was often passed down from parent to child or from teacher to apprentice, a tradition maintained in whispers. Misidentifying a plant could be deadly. Misunderstanding dosage could render an herb useless or fatal. The medieval forest, therefore, was both pharmacy and peril. As night approached, the forest changed. Darkness intensified every sense but vision. Travelers sharpened hearing and smell, relying on cues invisible to the eye. The call of a nocturnal bird, the rustle of a small animal, the scent of rain-soaked earth. All were signals of life and danger alike. Campfires, if used, had to be small, carefully shielded, and extinguished properly. Sleep was light, one eye open, ears alert. Wolves, bears, and other predators roamed freely. The unprepared became prey. Even humans, bandits or desperate wanderers, posed a threat. The medieval forest was a school of awareness, teaching lessons in patience, observation, and humility. Each day survived was a testament to skill, knowledge, and respect for the living world. Maps were unnecessary. The forest itself was the guide. Travelers marked trees subtly, left small signs for allies, or simply memorized routes using natural landmarks. In every stone, stream, and branch lay information. The challenge was learning to read it. Survival, above all, demanded adaptation. A man could not merely walk through the forest. He had to merge with it, anticipate its moods, and respect its rhythms. Mud, moss, and even the scent of crushed herbs could conceal one from predators. The forest did not forgive arrogance or haste. Knowledge, patience, and careful observation were paramount. Those who mastered the woods carried a silent authority. They moved like ghosts, unseen yet fully aware. And in the deep heart of the medieval forest, a truth emerged. The forest was not simply a backdrop for survival. It was a living, breathing entity, testing, teaching, and sometimes punishing those who entered. It held secrets older than kingdom's wisdom passed from generation to generation, waiting for the careful, patient, and observant to learn. Only by becoming part of this rhythm, not merely an intruder, could one hope to endure the dark, intricate, and unforgiving world of the medieval woods. The forest, by now fully awake, seemed to expand endlessly in every direction. Every tree stood like a sentinel, branches intertwined, roots tangled beneath the surface like an invisible web. The medieval traveler understood instinctively that this place was alive in a way cities could never be. Every rustle, every movement carried information. Even the smallest details. A leaf turned in a peculiar way, a patch of moss slightly elevated from the ground, a scattering of acorns, held meaning for those trained to observe. These subtle signals could indicate a nearby predator, a hidden water source, or a change in weather that might not be visible to an untrained eye. In the Middle Ages, survival meant harmonizing with the forest rather than attempting to conquer it. Travelers carried minimal gear, a flint and steel for fire, a small knife for cutting and hunting, perhaps a leather satchel holding the barest essentials, a piece of cloth for filtering water, a bundle of dried herbs, and a small supply of salted meat or bread. But their most valuable tools were their senses and knowledge. They learned to read the forest like a book written in shadows, smells, and sounds. The forest's language was subtle, but those who mastered it could travel for days without leaving a trace, find food when others would starve, and avoid dangers that would surprise the unwary. Tracking game, or observing the movements of wild animals, was an art as much as a necessity. Deer, for example, were not simply creatures to hunt. They were teachers. Hunters noted the paths where the undergrowth was flattened, the discarded hides of acorns, and the locations of small scrapes in the soil where hooves had churned the earth. Wolves were equally intelligent and far more dangerous, their packs moving with coordinated precision. Humans had to approach all wildlife with humility, learning the patterns and respecting the rules of survival that the creatures themselves unconsciously enforced. Any misstep could lead to disaster. A startled boar could charge with lethal force, a wolf might track a careless scent, and even the smallest misjudgment could leave a traveler lost, hungry, or exposed to harsh elements. Shelter in the forest required ingenuity and an understanding of natural materials. Lean-tos constructed from interwoven branches could provide temporary refuge, while hollow trees or natural caves offered more secure and insulated protection. Insulation from cold and dampness was vital. Travelers used moss, pine needles, and leaves to create bedding that absorbed moisture and retained warmth. They learned which plants repelled insects and could be used to line sleeping areas, and which vines or fibers could strengthen the structure of a rudimentary shelter. In some cases, small water channels were diverted to prevent flooding, and carefully chosen stones created windbreaks that amplified the warmth of small fires. Fire remained central to survival, yet it demanded skill and discretion. Flint and steel were used to generate embers, which were then nurtured into flame using dried moss, birch bark, or other tinder carefully collected from the forest floor. Fire could cook food, sterilize water, and provide warmth, but it could also betray one's location to predators or hostile humans. Smoke was monitored meticulously. The slightest wisp could signal presence across long distances. In some cases, travelers used underground pits or rocks to contain fires, heating stones to cook without visible flames, a technique that required patience and careful timing. Food preparation and foraging were exercises in observation and prudence. Edible plants were abundant, but often disguised among poisonous counterparts. Wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and dandelion greens provided sustenance when game was unavailable. Mushrooms were studied carefully. One misidentification could result in fatal consequences. Travelers relied on multiple tests, observing which animals consumed certain fungi, noting seasonal patterns, and testing in small quantities before consumption. Knowledge of water plants, berries, nuts, and roots was passed from elder to apprentice, forming a silent curriculum of survival. Water, the most essential element, required vigilance. Streams often meandered unpredictably, and not all water was safe to drink. Travelers learned to identify clean water by observing insect activity, animal behavior, and even plant growth. Bees, dragonflies, and other insects frequently indicated fresh water sources. Straining water through moss, cloth, or layers of leaves reduced contamination. Boiling was ideal, but fuel scarcity or stealth concerns often demanded alternative methods, such as preheating stones to sterilize or cook water indirectly. Medical knowledge was equally vital. Herbal remedies for injuries and illnesses were critical to survival. Willow bark alleviated pain and reduced fevers. Yarrow staunched bleeding, and mint or sage aided digestion. But efficacy relied on preparation, timing, and application. Misidentifying plants or improper treatment could worsen injuries, highlighting the medieval forest's unforgiving nature. Observing animals' behavior often informed treatment choices. Creatures instinctively gravitated to certain herbs for injury or illness. Lessons keenly noted by humans who relied entirely on their environment. Night transformed the forest into an alien world. Darkness demanded heightened senses. Hearing, smell, and touch replaced sight. Travelers would listen for shifts in the wind, the distant call of nocturnal birds, or the scuffing of leaves to detect predators. Wolves, bears, and other forest creatures moved with stealth and precision. Humans remained vulnerable, forced to rely on vigilance, intuition, and defensive positioning. Even fire, if used carelessly, could invite attack by revealing location. Travelers learned to extinguish embers completely, masking both heat and smoke to avoid detection. The medieval forest also contained hidden dangers in terrain itself. Swamps, bogs, and sudden ravines posed lethal threats. Travelers had to memorize topography instinctively, noting the firmness of soil, the density of underbrush, and subtle inclinations of the land. Roots, rocks, and moss-covered hollows could conceal hazards. A simple misstep could result in broken bones or entrapment. Knowledge of terrain, therefore, was as crucial as knowledge of food, water, or shelter. In addition to physical dangers, the forest was a crucible of social survival. Bandits, soldiers, or other desperate humans often lurked, requiring constant awareness. Travelers relied on subtle cues: disturbed foliage, footprints, discarded tools, or unusual sounds. Communication between allies was often silent. Marks on trees, small arrangements of stones, or hidden signals conveyed messages without alerting outsiders. This silent language of the forest was a crucial tool, extending beyond physical survival into strategy, coordination, and mutual protection. Adaptation to the forest required more than skill. It demanded mindset. Travelers cultivated patience, observation, and humility. Haste was punished. Arrogance often led to missteps or exposure. Over generations, those who mastered the forest developed a symbiotic relationship with it, learning to anticipate patterns of wildlife, read subtle shifts in climate, and used natural materials for protection and sustenance. They moved as shadows, present yet unseen, attuned to every nuance of their environment. By the end of day, the forest had imparted lessons to those who listened. It had revealed its secrets slowly. The location of water, the edible plants, the sleeping patterns of animals, the routes least traveled by hostile humans. Survival in the medieval forest was a cumulative achievement, the result of acute perception, knowledge passed down, and an almost spiritual respect for the rhythms of life surrounding the traveler. The forest, in its infinite complexity, had taught endurance, cunning, and reverence. To leave it alive was to understand it, at least partially, and to have internalized centuries of wisdom, lessons invisible to those untrained or heedless. The medieval forest, by now fully embracing the afternoon, had a way of transforming itself with the shifting sun. Light filtered through the canopy in streaks of gold and green, touching only fragments of the forest floor while leaving the rest in deep shadow. The trees themselves seemed like living fortresses, their trunks wide and gnarled, roots coiling through the earth like serpents. To the untrained eye, the forest appeared static, perhaps even serene. But to those who had learned its ways, the hermits, hunters, and travelers who had survived for days or weeks among its vastness, it was an ever-changing entity, responding to every footstep, every movement, every rustle of clothing or leather against bark. The first rule of deep forest survival remained observation. Travelers had to learn the subtle language of movement, both human and animal, the faint depressions in soft earth, the orientation of broken twigs, the scattered arrangement of leaves all conveyed information. A careful observer could determine not only the presence of animals, but also estimate their size, direction, and intent. Wolves, whose cunning had been immortalized in countless tales, could be anticipated by understanding their hunting patterns, pack dynamics, and trail selection. The medieval traveler needed to move in ways that mimicked nature itself, blending into the shadows, moving with the rhythm of the forest, and never allowing haste or panic to betray location. Fire remained an essential but dangerous ally. It could cook food, ward off predators, and provide warmth, but it demanded precision in timing and placement. Flint and steel were precious. Lighting a spark on wet moss, birch bark, or dried grass required patience and practice. Once lit, the fire had to be managed carefully, its smoke and glow minimized to prevent drawing attention from hostile humans or predators. Experienced travelers often used indirect methods, heating stones in a controlled fire and then placing them under food to cook slowly, or concealing embers beneath soil to preserve warmth overnight. Fire was as much a weapon of survival as it was a tool of sustenance. Water, as ever, was a constant concern. Streams were not always apparent, and bogs or stagnant pools could prove deadly. Observation was key. Travelers studied the behavior of insects, birds, and small mammals, bees hovering over clear water, dragonflies tracing the edges of running streams, and the quiet movement of animals toward hidden springs all indicated sources of potable water. Purification was often improvised. Water was strained through layers of cloth, moss, or woven leaves to remove sediment and debris. Boiling was ideal when fuel allowed, but discretion often outweighed convenience. Survival demanded not just access, but safe and stealthy access. Food foraged from the forest required discernment. Wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and sorrel-like greens offered sustenance when game was scarce. Seasonal berries provided both nutrition and hydration, but required knowledge of safe types, proper ripeness, and potential poisons. Mushrooms were particularly perilous. Knowledge had to be passed carefully, orally, often from elder to apprentice, warning each generation of subtle differences between edible and toxic species. Travelers also observed the diet of forest animals, learning what was safe and how to prepare it. In this way, the medieval forest functioned as both provider and teacher. Hunting was a sophisticated skill, blending patience, strategy, and deep understanding of forest ecology. Deer, rabbits, boars, Each species presented unique challenges. Observing footprints, droppings, and feeding grounds allowed hunters to predict movement and behavior. The wind was always considered. Even the slightest scent carried could betray location. Hunters learned to create blinds from natural materials, using fallen branches, moss, and reeds to conceal themselves. Traps were designed from vines, branches, and natural contours, often ingeniously camouflaged to lure or ensnare prey without alarming other forest creatures. Shelter in the medieval forest demanded adaptability. Temporary lean-tos were common for short stops, crafted from interwoven branches and insulated with moss and leaves. Hollow trees, shallow caves, or natural depressions in the terrain provided more long-term refuge. Bedding required careful preparation. Layers of pine needles, leaves, or reeds kept moisture away from the body while retaining warmth. Travelers learned to choose sites with subtle natural defenses: higher ground to avoid flooding, dense thickets to obscure visibility, and proximity to water while minimizing risk of exposure. Medicinal knowledge was vital. Plants like willow bark reduced pain, yarrow stemmed bleeding, and various herbs aided digestion or treated infections. Mastery required careful observation of the forest ecosystem. Some remedies were gleaned from animal behavior, which plants injured animals gravitated toward, or what herbs birds or small mammals sought when sick. This knowledge was often secret, taught orally to trusted apprentices or family members. A single misidentification could be fatal, emphasizing the unforgiving nature of the forest. Navigation relied on observation and intuition rather than maps or instruments. Travelers memorized landmarks, tracked the position of the sun, and noted subtle differences in vegetation to maintain direction. Moss on trees, typically found on the northern side, was a guide, as were patterns of lichen, wind exposure on ridges, and the behavior of local fauna. Hidden signs, marks carved into bark, small piles of stones, or arranged sticks, communicated safe paths or warned of dangers, forming a silent network of knowledge passed among those familiar with the forest. The medieval forest demanded respect and humility. Haste could lead to injury, illness, or death. Travelers adapted to the forest's rhythm, moving when winds were favorable, hunting when prey was abundant, and resting when danger was minimal. They learned to anticipate weather changes from subtle shifts in air, cloud formation, and the behavior of animals. Patience and attentiveness were as crucial as physical endurance or technical skill. Nightfall transformed the forest entirely. Darkness heightened all other senses. Travelers relied on hearing, smell, and tactile awareness. The distant howl of wolves, the rustle of leaves, or the approach of a large mammal were interpreted with precision. Even humans posed threats. Bandits or other desperate travelers could be concealed in the shadows, necessitating vigilance. Firelight was carefully controlled, used sparingly, shielded, and extinguished completely when no longer needed to prevent detection. Sleep was brief, alertness maintained even in rest, and safety was negotiated constantly with the landscape itself. By mid-evening, the forest had imparted its lessons, subtle survival skills, ecological awareness, and a deeper understanding of the symbiosis between humans and nature. Travelers who mastered these methods could endure weeks in isolation, hunting, foraging, and moving unseen. The forest was more than a backdrop. It was a living classroom, a test, and a refuge. Its wisdom, passed down from one generation to the next, ensured that those who respected it survived, while the careless or arrogant perished. The medieval forest had shifted subtly in the hours since dawn, its character changing with the angle of sunlight and the passage of time. Shadows lengthened, deepening the spaces between trunks and casting familiar landmarks into eerie unfamiliarity. Every root, every fallen branch, every moss-covered rock had to be memorized and interpreted for survival. Travelers learned that the forest itself was a living, breathing entity. It reacted to movement, sounds, and the very presence of humans in ways that modern observers could scarcely comprehend. The whispers of wind through leaves, the faint creak of an old tree branch, the distant splash of a small animal in a brook, all communicated essential information to those who knew how to listen. Observation was the lifeblood of survival. Every step carried consequence, and each miscalculation could be fatal. A misplaced footfall might alert a predator to your presence, while a misread shadow could conceal a hidden pit or bog. Travelers in the medieval era depended not on tools or instruments, but on their acute senses and intimate knowledge of the environment. They memorized subtle changes in the forest, which trees bore fruit at certain times, where the soil remained soft and moist, how animals marked territory, and how insects congregated near water sources. The forest was both provider and instructor, rewarding careful study and punishing ignorance. Water remained paramount. Clean streams were vital, but not always visible or easily accessible. Travelers interpreted the behavior of forest creatures. A line of deer hoofprints might lead to a hidden spring, or the flight of birds toward the canopy could indicate a nearby waterhole. Bees and dragonflies often signaled the presence of fresh water. Once located, water required purification. Cloth, moss, and leaves were used to filter debris, while heat from carefully managed embers could sterilize it. The process demanded skill, timing, and caution. Even the act of collecting water could expose the traveler to predators or hostile humans. Food acquisition was an equally exacting discipline. Plants offered sustenance but also danger. Wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and other edible greens had to be identified correctly, harvested at the right time, and prepared properly. Berries and fruits required knowledge of seasons and ripeness, as some could cause illness if eaten prematurely. Mushrooms presented the highest risk. Travelers observed animal behavior to determine safety, tested small portions before consuming, and relied on oral tradition passed from elders to apprentices. Hunting supplemented foraging. Deer, boars, and rabbits were tracked with patience, their movements predicted by footprints, droppings, and disturbed foliage. Traps made from natural materials, such as springy branches or carefully tied vines, provided sustenance without direct confrontation, while still requiring an intimate understanding of animal behavior and forest ecology. Shelter in the medieval forest was both a necessity and an art. Temporary lean-tos made from interwoven. Branches offered short-term protection, while hollow trees, caves, or natural depressions provided longer-term refuge. Travelers layered bedding with pine needles, moss, and leaves to retain warmth and keep moisture at bay. Location was vital. Elevated spots avoided flooding, dense underbrush concealed the shelter from prying eyes, and proximity to water balanced convenience with safety. Travelers also manipulated natural features to improve protection, using stones as windbreaks, diverting small water flows to prevent flooding, or masking the smell of food to avoid detection by predators or humans. Fire remained an essential yet perilous tool. Flint and steel produced the first spark, often coaxed to flame with dried moss or birch bark. Flames provided warmth, allowed cooking, and could be used as a signaling device. Yet even a small wisp of smoke could betray one's presence. Experienced travelers managed embers with precision, burying them under soil, cooking indirectly with heated stones, and extinguishing completely before sleeping. Knowledge of wood types was critical. Resinous woods burned hot and fast, while others produced long-lasting embers suitable for overnight warmth. Herbal remedies were indispensable. Willow bark reduced pain and fever. Yarrow treated wounds. Sage and mint aided digestion. Knowledge of medicinal plants was painstakingly acquired through observation of the forest and animal behavior. Certain plants were gathered at precise times of day or during specific lunar phases to maximize potency. Misidentification could be fatal. This wisdom was passed orally, from master to apprentice, forming a hidden curriculum of survival techniques largely forgotten in the modern era. Navigation in the dense forest relied on intuition and environmental cues. Sunlight patterns, moss growth, tree orientation, and the behavior of wildlife all provided subtle guidance. Small signs left by previous travelers, marks carved into bark, arranged stones, or subtle ground disturbances communicated directions or warnings. Travelers internalized these signs, learning to interpret the forest's language and move with confidence. Every choice, when to move, where to rest, what to eat, was informed by constant vigilance, observation, and patience. Predator awareness was critical. Wolves, bears, and wild cats patrolled the forest with instincts honed over generations. Travelers learned to recognize the signs of their presence: scat, tracks, or disturbed vegetation. Even a misjudged step or sound could provoke a dangerous encounter. Humans were as much a threat as animals. Bandits, deserters, or rival travelers could be lurking unseen. Silence, concealment, and careful movement were as vital as food, water, or shelter. Nightfall brought heightened intensity. Darkness sharpened all senses except sight. Travelers interpreted every rustle, every scent, every shift in air pressure. Small nocturnal sounds. An insect's wing beat, the movement of small mammals, the distant cry of an owl, could signal both safety and danger. Vigilance was constant. Even sleep was light, interrupted by instincts honed for survival. Firelight was carefully controlled, used sparingly and shielded, extinguished entirely to avoid revealing location. Over days, travelers became extensions of the forest itself. Movement, observation, and patience merged to form a rhythm of survival. The forest taught endurance, caution, and respect. Mistakes were rarely forgiven. One wrong step could lead to injury, exposure, or death. But those who listened, observed, and adapted could navigate for weeks, hunting, foraging, and finding shelter while remaining largely unseen. The medieval forest was a living repository of knowledge, a complex network of interdependent systems and cues. Trees, plants, animals, and terrain all conveyed information to those who had learned to perceive it. The traveler's mind had to remain alert, synthesizing constant streams of sensory input to make life or death decisions. This symbiotic relationship between human and forest defined survival in ways that modern preppers, with their tools and gadgets, could scarcely imagine. By the end of any given day, the forest had imparted lessons: which plants were edible, which animals were nearby, how terrain could conceal or expose, and when to move or rest. It was not enough to survive physically. Travelers needed mental resilience, acute observation, and a spiritual respect for the living environment. Only then could one hope to emerge from the medieval forest alive, carrying the silent wisdom of generations past, ready to pass it on to the next traveler who dared enter this dense, shadowed, and mysterious world. The medieval forest stretched endlessly, a vast and complex ecosystem that had endured centuries of human intrusion, natural cycles, and silent observation. Every layer of the forest held knowledge. The upper canopy whispered secrets of the weather, birds, and distant dangers. The middle layer offered clues to animal activity and potential food sources. The forest floor, often shrouded in shadow, contained hidden streams, edible plants, and concealed hazards. To survive here, one had to perceive every level, integrate its lessons, and move in harmony with the rhythm of life around them. Morning mist lingered among the roots and ferns, creating an ethereal atmosphere that both concealed and revealed. Travelers, moving with care, could detect the faint traces of previous passage: a disturbed leaf, a scuff in soft earth, or the subtle scent of smoke from a long extinguished fire. These traces conveyed critical information: the presence of other humans, the proximity of predators, or the path to a water source. Medieval travelers developed an intimate understanding of such cues, translating subtle signs into actionable knowledge that determined survival. Observation remained the central principle. Every sound, movement, and scent conveyed a message. The forest's inhabitants, deer, boars, wolves, birds, and insects, all operated within predictable patterns that could be studied and anticipated. Deer paths indicated the location of feeding grounds. Wolf tracks suggested hunting behavior. The flight of birds often presaged weather changes. These natural indicators were more reliable than any written map or compass, which were often scarce or inaccurate. Travelers learned to internalize these cues, developing an instinctual map of the forest in their minds. Water acquisition remained a critical concern. Streams and springs were the lifeblood of survival, but accessing them demanded discretion and knowledge. Travelers used indirect observation: bees congregating near water, dragonflies skimming the surface, and the habits of mammals all signaled sources of fresh water. Contamination was a constant risk, and purification was improvised through cloth, moss, or layers of leaves. When fire was available, boiling provided safety. But stealth often required alternative methods: preheating stones to sterilize water, careful collection in hollowed bark, or using moss filtration to remove sediment. Food, similarly, required precision. Foraging provided greens such as wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and dandelion, while berries and nuts supplemented nutrition. Mushrooms required acute knowledge. Some were edible, others fatal, and the differences were subtle. Travelers observed animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and oral tradition to identify safe varieties. Hunting was equally demanding. Predators like boars or wolves required understanding both their behavior and the terrain. Traps constructed from branches, vines, and natural depressions demanded ingenuity, timing, and camouflage. The medieval traveler had to anticipate both the prey and the environmental conditions that influenced its behavior. Shelter in the forest was essential. Temporary lean-tos were constructed from interwoven branches and insulated with moss and leaves, while hollow trees or natural depressions offered longer-term refuge. Travelers carefully selected sites: higher ground to avoid flooding, dense thickets for concealment, proximity to water balanced with safety, and subtle manipulation of natural features to improve shelter. Stones were used as windbreaks, diverted streams prevented flooding, and natural odor masking techniques kept food and presence undetectable to predators or humans. Fire was a dual-edged necessity. It provided warmth, a cooking method, and even a signaling mechanism, but it could also reveal one's location. Flint and steel sparked embers into life, often coaxed with dried moss or birch bark. Travelers mastered indirect cooking, heating stones in controlled fires, burying embers, and extinguishing smoke completely to avoid detection. Knowledge of wood types was essential. Resinous woods burned hot and fast, while others maintained long-lasting embers. Fire management required both skill and discretion. Medicinal knowledge was vital. Willow bark relieved pain, yarrow stopped bleeding, sage and mint aided digestion, and a range of forest plants served as remedies for minor infections or ailments. Travelers learned these methods through observation of nature, animals, and oral instruction passed down across generations. Correct timing, preparation, and application were critical. Mistakes could result in illness or death. The medieval forest was as much a pharmacy as it was a home and battlefield. Navigation relied on observation and intuition. Travelers memorized subtle landmarks, sun patterns, and the orientation of moss and lichen. Small signs left by previous travelers, carved marks, stones, arranged sticks, indicated safe paths or hazards. Integration of these cues formed a mental map, allowing movement through dense forests without reliance on modern instruments. Each movement required attention to micro details: the firmness of soil, air shifts indicating approaching weather, subtle patterns in animal movement. Predator awareness was paramount. Wolves, bears, and large cats patrolled silently, their tracks and behavior carefully studied to anticipate threats. Humans posed equal danger. Bandits, deserters, or rival travelers moved with equal stealth. Survival required continuous vigilance, silence, and the ability to merge with the environment. Night amplified risk. Darkness heightened all senses except sight, and even minor mistakes could lead to fatal encounters. Travelers learned to sleep lightly, manage fire stealthily, and move carefully under the cover of night. Over weeks, travelers became extensions of the forest, their senses attuned to patterns, cues, and dangers. They learned to anticipate weather, track game, find water, and construct shelters without leaving visible traces. Survival was both a mental and physical achievement, requiring patience, observation, and constant adaptation. The medieval forest was a living classroom, offering lessons in endurance, resourcefulness, and humility. By the end of any extended sojourn, the forest had imparted its wisdom: when to forage, where to hunt, which paths were safe, how to filter water, how to construct shelters, and how to remain undetected. These lessons, passed down from one generation to the next, ensured that only those who respected the forest and adhered to its unspoken rules could survive. The forest was not merely a setting, it was an active participant in the survival of every traveler, a teacher whose lessons were as unforgiving as they were vital. The deeper one ventured, the more complex the survival strategies became. Tracking multiple sources of water, identifying seasonal shifts in plant growth, predicting predator movement, and constructing multi-layered shelters required constant attention. Travelers became patient, analytical, and highly observant. They learned to anticipate subtle environmental cues, the scent of approaching rain, the direction of a wind shift, the behavior of insects indicating predation or safety. Fire, water, food, shelter, navigation, predator avoidance, and medicinal knowledge coalesced into a symbiotic understanding. Travelers who mastered these elements moved like shadows, interacting with the forest without disturbing its balance, yet extracting all that was necessary for survival. They respected the forest's rhythms, followed the patterns of wildlife, and internalized knowledge that would allow them to emerge after days, weeks, or even months, having lived in near complete integration with this ancient, complex environment. The medieval forest, in the fading light of late afternoon, assumed a different character. Shadows stretched longer, merging to create deceptive shapes along the forest floor. Trees, previously distinguishable, became pillars in a dark labyrinth, hiding both danger and opportunity. Travelers had long understood that this forest was alive in every sense. Its rhythms, movements, and even smells communicated as much as speech did. It was a place where the eyes alone could not convey truth. One needed a full spectrum of senses, honed over days, weeks, or years of practice, to interpret every subtle clue. Observation remained paramount. Every footprint, every broken branch, every bend in a stream told a story. A careful traveler could discern the species, size, and intent of creatures moving nearby. Deer tracks indicated feeding patterns, wolves' paw prints signaled hunting behavior, and the scatter of small mammals suggested imminent movement. The medieval traveler interpreted these signs in real time, integrating them into decisions that could determine survival. Failure to read these signals could result in injury, starvation, or death. Water sources were the lifeblood of the forest. Streams and hidden springs were not always obvious, but they could be inferred from the behavior of wildlife. Bees congregating near a spring, dragonflies skimming the surface, and deer trails leading toward dense underbrush all indicated fresh water. Travelers filtered water using moss, leaves, or cloth, and when fire was available, sterilization through boiling ensured safety. Subtle techniques, such as heating stones to purify water or using underground collection methods, demonstrated the ingenuity necessary for medieval forest survival. Foraging provided critical nutrition. Edible greens such as wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and dandelion offered sustenance. Seasonal berries and nuts added essential calories and hydration. Mushrooms demanded extreme caution. One misidentification could be fatal. Travelers observed animals and consulted oral knowledge passed down through generations to identify safe varieties. Hunting supplemented the diet. Tracking deer, boar, and rabbits required both patience and understanding of environmental patterns. Traps made from vines, branches, and natural terrain offered passive hunting methods relying on camouflage, timing, and deep ecological understanding. Shelter was essential for survival. Temporary lean-tos provided short-term refuge, while hollow trees, caves, and natural depressions allowed extended stays. Bedding made from leaves, moss, and pine needles insulated against cold and dampness. Travelers selected shelter sites strategically, elevated positions to avoid flooding, dense underbrush for concealment, proximity to water balanced with the risk of exposure. Stones created windbreaks, diverted streams prevented inundation, and careful placement of shelter concealed human presence from both predators and hostile humans. Fire management was a delicate art. Fire provided warmth, cooking capabilities, and the means to signal allies, but it also revealed location. Flint and steel produced sparks, nurtured with dried moss or birch bark. Travelers mastered indirect cooking using heated stones and concealed embers to prevent detection. Knowledge of wood types was essential. Resinous woods burned quickly with high heat, while other varieties produced slow-burning embers. The medieval traveler balanced fire's utility against its potential danger constantly. Herbal knowledge ensured physical health. Willow bark relieved pain and fever. Yarrow stemmed bleeding. Sage and mint aided digestion. Misidentification or improper preparation could have fatal consequences. Travelers studied plant behavior, animal interactions, and traditional oral instruction to develop a functional understanding of the forest's pharmacopoeia. These lessons, often secret and passed selectively, were indispensable to surviving prolonged periods in the forest. Navigation relied on environmental awareness and mental mapping. Travelers memorized landmarks, sun and shadow patterns, the orientation of moss and lichen, and subtle terrain features. Previous travelers' markers, carved bark, arranged stones, or disturbed foliage, provided guidance, forming a layered understanding of the forest's pathways. Integration of these cues allowed movement without reliance on tools like compasses or maps. Predator awareness was constant. Wolves, bears, and large cats moved stealthily, and humans, bandits, deserters, or rival travelers, presented equivalent risks. Survival demanded constant vigilance, discretion, and knowledge of escape and concealment techniques. Night heightened danger, darkness intensified senses, amplified uncertainty, and required skill in silent movement and fire management. Travelers slept lightly, maintaining awareness even in rest. Extended forest survival created a profound connection. Travelers became attuned to subtle changes, shifts in wind, moisture, and wildlife behavior. They anticipated weather changes, tracked prey movements, located water sources, and adapted shelters for prolonged stays. Each day reinforced lessons in patience, observation, and environmental integration. By the end of weeks, travelers operated almost instinctively, moving like shadows through the forest, interacting with its living systems while remaining largely invisible. The forest served as both teacher and test. Every day brought challenges: identifying safe food, constructing shelters, purifying water, avoiding predators, and maintaining health. Knowledge accumulated incrementally, requiring adaptation and reflection. Travelers learned to respect the forest's power, recognizing it not as mere backdrop, but as an active participant in survival. Those who ignored its lessons perished. Those who embraced them endured, passing knowledge silently to future travelers. By nightfall, the forest's rhythm shifted. Sounds of nocturnal creatures, rustling leaves, and distant calls demanded heightened attention. Travelers moved cautiously, interpreting sensory input to anticipate threats. Firelight was minimized, smoke carefully managed, and positions chosen to maximize concealment. Even in rest, survival instincts persisted, reinforcing the idea that the medieval forest demanded constant awareness and respect. Ultimately, survival in the medieval forest was an amalgamation of observation, skill, knowledge, and patience. It required harmonizing with the environment, reading subtle signs, and interpreting a complex web of interactions. Water, food, shelter, fire, medicinal knowledge, navigation, predator awareness, and mental resilience combined into a single strategy, living in near-complete symbiosis with the forest. Travelers learned, endured, and emerged transformed, carrying wisdom that could only be gained through prolonged immersion in this intricate, ancient world. The medieval forest stretched endlessly, a living maze of greenery, shadows, and subtle movement. Sunlight filtered unevenly through thick canopies, falling in fractured beams that illuminated patches of moss and leaf litter. Each step taken by a traveler sent small vibrations through the ground, rustled leaves, and disturbed hidden creatures. For those who had learned the ways of the forest, each sound, smell, and visual cue conveyed meaning. A snapped twig could signal danger. A fluttering bird could indicate water nearby, and the smell of wet earth might reveal a concealed stream. Survival here was an intricate balance between perception, timing, and subtle action. Observation was the foundation of life in the forest. Travelers studied the habits of animals and the contours of the land. Deer paths revealed feeding. Areas and routes frequently traveled, while the presence of droppings and hoof imprints indicated size, age, and behavior patterns. Wolves moved in coordinated packs, their tracks and scent trails providing crucial information about their hunting areas and times of activity. Even smaller animals, such as rabbits or squirrels, offered clues about available food sources, safe paths, and seasonal shifts. Medieval travelers integrated these details into an instinctual understanding of the forest's ecology, allowing them to anticipate dangers, locate resources, and move undetected. Water remained a vital element. Streams, springs, and hidden pools were not always apparent. Travelers relied on indirect observation, noting the congregation of insects, the movement of birds, and the presence of animal tracks. Bees and dragonflies indicated clean water, while the path of deer or boars often led to concealed springs. Filtering water using moss, cloth, or layers of leaves was routine, and when fire was available, boiling ensured safety. Advanced techniques, such as heating stones to purify water or constructing concealed channels to collect runoff, reflected the ingenuity and adaptability of medieval survival methods. Food acquisition demanded equal vigilance. Edible greens like wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and dandelion provided nutrition. Seasonal fruits, nuts, and berries supplemented sustenance, but knowledge of safe varieties and proper harvesting was essential. Mushrooms required the highest caution, as misidentification could be fatal. Observing the behavior of wildlife, studying oral traditions passed down through generations, and understanding seasonal changes were necessary to avoid poisoning. Hunting provided additional sustenance. Deer, boars, and rabbits were tracked using footprints, feeding signs, and instinctual reading of the terrain. Traps made from branches, vines, and natural depressions demonstrated ingenuity and careful planning, allowing travelers to acquire food while minimizing exposure to predators and rivals. Shelter was critical to survival. Temporary lean-tos constructed from interwoven branches and insulated with moss and leaves provided immediate refuge. Longer-term shelters included hollow trees, caves, and natural depressions in the terrain. Bedding made from pine needles, leaves, or reeds retained warmth and repelled moisture. Travelers selected sites carefully, balancing elevation to avoid flooding, concealment to reduce visibility, and proximity to water while maintaining security. Stones were arranged to form windbreaks, diverted water flows prevented inundation, and natural scents were masked to avoid detection. Effective shelter represented the culmination of observation, skill, and knowledge of the forest environment. Fire management was both necessary and hazardous. Flint and steel produced sparks, nurtured with dried moss, birch bark, or other tinder. Fire provided warmth, a method to cook food, and occasionally a signaling device. Yet smoke or visible flames could attract predators or hostile humans. Advanced techniques included indirect cooking with heated stones, careful burial of embers to maintain warmth, and meticulous extinguishing to prevent detection. Knowledge of wood types was essential. Resinous woods burned quickly with intense heat, while others produced slow-burning embers for prolonged use. Fire was a tool, weapon, and lifeline simultaneously. Medicinal knowledge ensured survival. Willow bark alleviated pain and fevers, yarrow stopped bleeding, and sage or mint aided digestion. Travelers studied plant morphology, environmental conditions, and animal behavior to identify effective remedies. Oral instruction, passed selectively from elders to apprentices, provided guidance on preparation and application. Errors could be fatal, reinforcing the forest's unforgiving nature. Knowledge of medicinal plants complemented food acquisition, shelter construction, and predator avoidance, forming an integrated survival system. Navigation relied on constant observation. Travelers memorized landmarks, patterns of sunlight and shadow, the orientation of moss and lichen, and subtle terrain differences. Signs left by previous travelers, carved bark, arranged stones, or disturbed foliage, supplemented environmental cues. Integrating these signals allowed for long-distance movement without reliance on instruments such as compasses or maps. Constant attention to microfeatures, including soil consistency, vegetation patterns, and changes in airflow, ensured safe travel and efficient resource acquisition. Predator awareness demanded continual vigilance. Wolves, bears, and other large mammals moved silently, hunting with intelligence and strategy. Humans, bandits, deserters, or rival travelers posed equivalent threats. Survival required acute perception, careful concealment, and knowledge of escape strategies. Night amplified danger. Darkness heightened hearing, smell, and tactile senses while reducing visual input. Travelers moved cautiously, managing fire and light to minimize exposure and sleeping lightly to remain alert. Even a momentary lapse could result in fatal encounters. Extended survival in the forest required adaptation to its rhythms. Travelers anticipated weather changes by observing cloud formations, wind patterns, and the behavior of animals. Food was procured based on seasonal knowledge. Water, sources were tracked, and shelters were adjusted according to environmental conditions. Over time, travelers developed near instinctual awareness, allowing them to navigate, forage, and hunt efficiently while maintaining concealment. Patience, observation, and mental resilience became as essential as physical endurance. The forest served as a teacher and arbiter of survival. Lessons accumulated incrementally: which plants were edible, how to identify hidden water, when and where to hunt, how to construct effective shelters, and how to avoid detection. This knowledge, refined through generations, allowed travelers to endure weeks in isolation, integrating fully with the ecosystem. By observing and respecting the forest, humans achieved a form of symbiosis, moving as shadows through the dense wilderness, acquiring sustenance without disturbing the balance of life around them. By the end of any extended journey, the Yasi, forest had imparted wisdom that could not be gained elsewhere. Awareness of seasonal cycles, predator-prey dynamics, resource management, medicinal applications, and the subtle art of stealth and observation. The medieval traveler emerged transformed, carrying knowledge forged through intimate engagement with one of the most complex and unforgiving environments on the planet. This understanding, largely lost to modern times, represented centuries of adaptation, skill, and survival instinct, a silent testament to the human capacity to coexist with and endure within the living wilderness. The medieval forest was a living, breathing entity that shifted with the seasons, sunlight, and the subtle movements of its countless inhabitants. Every tree, vine, and root carried information. Travelers learned to observe patterns in the growth of moss, the spread of fungi, and the orientation of lichen, all subtle indicators of environmental conditions. The ground itself offered clues: soil consistency, leaf litter arrangement, and the presence of small animal burrows all conveyed messages that the untrained eye could never perceive. Survival depended upon recognizing these cues and integrating them into immediate, practical decision-making. Observation remained the foundation of all forest survival. Travelers could identify the movement, size, and intent of animals based on faint footprints, broken twigs, or the position of scattered leaves. Deer tracks indicated feeding locations, boar trails suggested foraging or rooting behavior, and the presence of smaller mammals revealed both food sources and potential predators. Wolves, operating in coordinated packs, left tracks and scent trails that could be interpreted to avoid confrontation. Even subtle shifts in insect populations offered insights into water availability and weather patterns. Travelers internalized these patterns, transforming them into instinctual maps of the forest. Water sources were life-sustaining and often hidden. Streams, springs, and concealed pools were detected through indirect observation. The congregation of bees and dragonflies, bird movement, and the paths of mammals all indicated nearby fresh water. Travelers filtered water using moss, cloth, or woven leaves to remove debris, while boiling or indirect heat methods ensured safety. Advanced techniques included constructing channels from natural materials to collect runoff, carefully maintaining hygiene, and conserving limited firewood. The acquisition and management of water required skill, foresight, and constant vigilance. Food gathering was an exercise in precision and patience. Edible plants such as wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and dandelion offered vital nutrition. Seasonal berries, nuts, and fruits supplemented caloric intake, but knowledge of which species were safe and when to harvest was crucial. Mushrooms posed the greatest risk. Misidentification could lead to poisoning or death. Travelers relied on animal behavior, oral tradition, and seasonal awareness to navigate these hazards. Hunting offered additional sustenance. Tracking deer, boars, and rabbits required patience, knowledge of animal behavior, and understanding the terrain. Ingeniously constructed traps used branches, vines, and depressions in the ground, allowing food acquisition while minimizing risk of exposure to predators or hostile humans. Shelter was critical to maintaining warmth, safety, and morale. Temporary lean-tos constructed from interwoven branches provided short-term protection, while hollow trees, caves, and natural depressions enabled longer-term stays. Insulating bedding from pine needles, moss, and leaves prevented heat loss and mitigated moisture. Travelers carefully selected shelter sites to balance elevation, concealment, proximity to water, and natural defense. Stones and fallen logs were used to create windbreaks, diverted streams prevented flooding, and natural odor-masking techniques minimized detection. Shelter represented a combination of observation, skill, and deep knowledge of the forest. Fire management remained both a necessity and a risk. Fire provided warmth, cooking capability, and a potential signaling method, but careless management could expose one's location. Flint and steel created sparks, nurtured with dried moss or bark. Travelers mastered indirect cooking, using heated stones, burying embers for overnight warmth, and complete extinguishment of smoke. Knowledge of wood properties was essential. Resinous wood burned quickly with intense heat, while slower burning species provided lasting embers. Fire was simultaneously a lifeline, tool, and hazard. Herbal and medicinal knowledge ensured survival. Willow bark alleviated pain, yarrow stopped bleeding, and sage or mint aided digestion. Travelers observed animal behavior, plant morphology, and seasonal variations to identify effective remedies. Oral instruction passed down from elders to apprentices was critical. Preparation, timing, and application determined efficacy, and mistakes could be fatal. This knowledge integrated seamlessly with navigation, food acquisition, shelter construction, and predator avoidance, forming a cohesive system of survival. Navigation relied on observation and mental mapping. Travelers memorized landmarks, sun and shadow patterns, moss and lichen orientation, and terrain subtleties. Signs left by other travelers, carved markings, stones, or foliage disturbances provided additional guidance. Integrating environmental cues and human markers allowed for movement without instruments, a crucial skill for avoiding both natural and human threats. Awareness of microfeatures like soil firmness, vegetation density, and airflow ensured safety and resource efficiency. Predator awareness demanded constant vigilance. Wolves, bears, and other large mammals patrolled silently, hunting with instinct and strategy. Humans, bandits, deserters, and rival travelers represented equal threats. Survival required discretion, stealth, and mastery of escape and concealment techniques. Night amplified risk. Darkness heightened hearing, smell, and tactile perception while diminishing vision. Travelers moved cautiously, managed fire carefully, and slept lightly. A single lapse could result in injury or death. Extended survival in the forest required adaptation to environmental rhythms. Travelers anticipated weather, tracked animal behavior, located food and water, and adjusted shelters accordingly. Over time, their senses and instincts became finely tuned, allowing movement, hunting, and foraging to occur almost instinctively. Patience, observation, and mental resilience were as vital as as physical endurance. The forest acted as both instructor and judge. Lessons accumulated, recognizing edible plants, identifying hidden water, predicting predator activity, constructing durable shelters, and remaining undetected. This knowledge, refined over generations, enabled travelers to survive weeks in isolation, fully integrating with the ecosystem. Respect for the forest allowed humans to coexist with its inhabitants, harvesting sustenance without disrupting balance. By the end of prolonged immersion, travelers internalized the forest's wisdom, seasonal cycles, predator-prey dynamics, resource management, medicinal applications, stealth, and environmental interpretation. The medieval traveler emerged transformed, carrying knowledge gained only through intimate engagement with a complex, unforgiving environment. This expertise, largely lost to modern civilization, represented centuries of adaptation, ingenuity, and survival instinct, a testament to human resilience in the wild. The forest, by now, had grown darker, denser, and infinitely more intricate as the traveler delved deeper into its heart. Centuries of layered growth created a living labyrinth of trunks, roots, and underbrush. Sunlight barely penetrated the upper canopy, falling in narrow golden streaks that illuminated patches of the forest floor, but left the majority in shadow. Every footfall stirred the delicate balance of leaves and debris, carrying sound and scent in ways that could betray even the most careful intruder. Survival here was not merely about endurance. It required an intimate, almost symbiotic connection with the forest itself. Observation, the cornerstone of survival, had become second nature. Travelers interpreted the minutest signs. A leaf displaced in an unusual pattern could indicate a small animal or a lurking predator. A subtle scent shift suggested water nearby. Faint scratch marks on bark revealed the passage of a fox, boar, or wolf. These details, imperceptible to the untrained eye, informed every decision, whether to move, rest, hunt, or hide. The medieval forest functioned as a complex network of cues, each element interacting with countless others, forming a web of information that could be read and acted upon by those who had mastered its language. Water sources, vital and often concealed, demanded constant vigilance. Hidden springs, trickling brooks, and pools behind natural barriers were located through careful observation of wildlife behavior. Bees congregated near clean water, dragonflies skimmed the surface, and deer trails often led to concealed sources. Travelers employed techniques such as moss filtration, cloth straining, and the use of heated stones to purify water. Fire, when available, boiled water, but caution was paramount. Smoke could betray location to predators or hostile humans. Water management extended beyond mere acquisition. Conservation and stealth were essential components of long-term survival. Food acquisition required knowledge, patience, and precision. Wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, dandelion, seasonal berries, and nuts offered immediate nutrition. Mushrooms were particularly perilous. Misidentification could result in poisoning or death. Travelers relied on animal behavior, oral knowledge, and seasonal cues to identify safe varieties. Hunting supplemented foraging. Deer, boars, and rabbits required tracking through footprints, feeding signs, and environmental patterns. Ingeniously crafted traps using branches, vines, and natural depressions captured prey passively, reducing risk of exposure while providing sustenance. Shelter construction reflected both survival strategy and environmental awareness. Temporary lean-tos made from interwoven branches provided short-term refuge. Hollow trees, caves, and natural depressions allowed extended stays. Insulating bedding from moss, pine needles, and leaves preserved warmth and protected from moisture. Travelers selected sites for elevation, concealment, water access, and natural defense. Stones formed windbreaks, diverted streams prevented flooding, and natural scents were masked to avoid detection. Shelter required the integration of observation, skill, and deep understanding of the forest's microclimates and seasonal variations. Fire, simultaneously essential and hazardous, was mastered over countless hours of practice. Flint and steel created sparks, nurtured with dried moss or bark. Travelers controlled fire for warmth, cooking, and occasional signaling, while ensuring smoke and light did not reveal their presence. Advanced techniques included indirect cooking with heated stones, burying embers, and extinguishing all visible traces. Knowledge of wood types was crucial. Resinous woods burned intensely and briefly, while other species provided sustained heat. Fire management demanded discipline, foresight, and complete situational awareness. Medicinal knowledge remained a cornerstone of survival. Willow bark reduced pain and fever, yarrow stemmed bleeding, sage and mint aided digestion. Travelers observed plant morphology, animal interactions, and environmental conditions to identify effective remedies. Oral traditions, passed selectively through generations, guided preparation, timing, and application. A single misstep could prove fatal, reinforcing the forest's unforgiving nature. Medicinal knowledge complemented food gathering, shelter construction, and predator avoidance, forming a complete survival strategy. Navigation relied on acute observation and mental mapping. Travelers memorized landmarks, sun and shadow patterns, moss and lichen orientation, and subtle terrain nuances. Signs left by others, carved bark, arranged stones, or displaced foliage, offered supplemental guidance. Integrating these cues allowed movement over long distances without instruments, maintaining stealth and safety. Attention to microfeatures such as soil firmness, vegetation density, and airflow ensured survival efficiency and avoided unnecessary hazards. Predator awareness demanded constant, heightened vigilance. Wolves, bears, and large cats moved silently, hunting strategically and leaving faint traces. Humans, bandits, deserters, and rival travelers presented equivalent danger. Survival required discretion, stealth, and the ability to conceal presence and escape if necessary. Darkness heightened risk. Hearing, smell, and tactile senses intensified while visual perception diminished. Travelers slept lightly, maintained awareness during rest, and carefully managed fire and light sources to avoid detection. Long-term adaptation to the forest's rhythm became essential. Travelers anticipated weather changes by observing cloud patterns, wind shifts, and animal behaviors. Food sources were tracked according to seasonal patterns, water sources monitored, and shelters adjusted to environmental fluctuations. Over weeks, travelers developed an almost instinctive understanding of terrain, prey, and forest dynamics, allowing them to operate efficiently and safely. Patience, observation, and mental resilience became as critical as physical endurance. The forest functioned simultaneously as teacher, arbiter, and ally. Lessons accumulated over time, identifying edible plants, locating hidden water, predicting predator movement, constructing secure shelters, and moving undetected. Knowledge, honed through centuries of experience, allowed humans to coexist with and utilize the forest without disrupting its intricate balance. Respect for the environment was paramount. Arrogance or ignorance invited failure. Those who mastered these lessons could survive for weeks or months, blending seamlessly with the ecosystem. As night fell, the forest transformed further. Nocturnal creatures stirred, wind shifted, and unseen predators became active. Travelers interpreted every sound, scent, and subtle movement, making calculated decisions to hunt, forage, or remain hidden. Firelight was minimized and carefully managed, embers buried or shielded to avoid detection. Even in sleep, heightened awareness persisted, reinforcing the perpetual vigilance necessary for long-term survival. Ultimately, survival in the medieval forest represented the culmination of countless skills integrated into a single coherent strategy. Observation, water management, food acquisition, shelter construction, fire mastery, medicinal knowledge, navigation, predator awareness, and mental resilience converged. Travelers became extensions of the forest itself, operating in near-perfect harmony with the living ecosystem. By the conclusion of their journey, they had internalized the forest's lessons, emerging transformed, skilled, resourceful, and attuned to an ancient wisdom largely lost to modern civilization. The medieval forest, with all its dangers, resources, and subtleties, offered a final testament. Survival depended on respect, patience, knowledge, and integration. Those who approached it with humility, attentiveness, and care could endure, while those who underestimated its complexity faltered. It was a living classroom, a test of character, and a crucible of skill and endurance. To survive was to understand, to anticipate, and to move in harmony with one of the most intricate, challenging, and unforgiving environments on Earth. By the end of Scene 10, the traveler, having navigated water scarcity, foraged food, constructed shelters, avoided predators, mastered fire, and internalized medicinal and environmental wisdom, emerged with an unparalleled understanding of survival. The medieval forest, once a formidable adversary, had become both teacher and ally, its secrets revealed to those willing to observe, adapt, and respect its hidden language. This culmination marked the end of the journey, the apex of medieval forest survival knowledge, and the passing of ancient wisdom into the hands of a skilled, attentive traveler.